Today, we are doing a deeper dive into key lights, fill lights, rim lights, background lights, and how you can get exactly what you want from each of these and how best to make them all work together. Hi there, I'm Chris Knight, a New York-based portrait and commercial photographer, and today we are doing a deeper dive into different types of exposures you will encounter in the studio. Now, this is going to be a little bit more of a moderate level lighting class, so just in case you need a little bit of a refresher or you want to kind of revisit the fundamentals or you're just not sure what to do, check the description below for the first video in the series where we go over a lot of that information. So before we can actually dig into setting this up, we need to address a couple of things that are going to be really important to this process. Firstly, the idea of controlling the light, shaping the light that you have, and really only putting it where you want. So you're going to see me use a variety of modifiers that restrict light in this studio setup to not necessarily bounce everywhere and influence some of the other lights. Second, we are going to be using our meter, in this case the Sekonic 858, to get exact readings of each of the individual lights so that we can know for sure what each of them are going to be doing. After that, we are going to do an editorial portrait inspired by Joseph Karsh, who, the more you start to understand the math and the formula behind a lot of what we're doing here today, you'll find how well it translates into that sort of work, how precise it can be, and easy for you to kind of take inspiration from it, understand what the tones are doing, and how you can translate it into your images. So as we take out our meter, I'm going to be using flash throughout all of this. Just for consistency's sake, I can get a good bit of power. They allow me to dial the power in to exactly what I need, and they're just going to be a little bit more flexible and easy to use versus a continuous light, but you can get the same effect from continuous light sources, especially if they are producing hard light. Softlight, for this particular setup, not as much, but power still works the same. As I am using my light meter, I'm going to be measuring what each of them are doing, and you'll see me do a couple of different things. Now, if you watch the first video, remember the meter can be used in a couple of different ways. You can use it to roughly set the camera where you want it to be, but you can also use it as a way of measuring how powerful one light is to another one or where the light falls in the scene. And that's what we're going to be doing here, is that second part, how lights are going to be powered compared to the other lights in the scene. Now, this dome here is an important feature that's going to help me make sure I'm measuring the exact light that I need correctly. You can also, by the way, turn off the lights you're not using, and that can be a helpful way to measure. But this retractable dome here lets me either read all of the light that's hitting it, or as I pull it in, you'll see that it kind of blocks light from hitting it unless you are pointing it at the source. And this can give you a little bit more of a directional read. I will oftentimes use this in combination with my hand to maybe block light that's hitting it, just to make sure that I'm reading only the light that I'm pointing at. And if all else fails, if you're mixing multiple lights together, flip them off, and using the remote to do that can be an easy way to achieve it. Now, let's talk for just a minute about the jobs of light. Generally, I like to think about lighting in the studio. I'm not talking about lighting a scene, but a very structured portrait to have a purpose, right? And it usually, for me, a light needs to fulfill one of 4 different things. This is not an absolute rule, but I do find that thinking about this, especially as we're kind of learning what lights do in the studio, can be very, very helpful. The 4 jobs of light that I will basically give to any light that I put up is it needs to be the key light, or the main light, the fill light, the rim light, or the background light. So let's break down and explain what each of them are. The first of which is the key light. The key light is going to be your main light. This is likely going to set the overall look, feel, mood, and even exposure of the image. We're not talking necessarily about what kind of modifier you use, the quality of light that you use. Those have their own characteristics that are going to add to the look and feel of the image. We're really looking at exposure primarily. So know that the variety that you create from all of these different modifier choices is from the combination of types of modifiers you use, the power of the modifier, the position of the modifier. All of those things contribute to the look and feel of your lighting, But for now, we are mostly going to be focusing on power and how that affects the light relationships between your lights. So the key light is that main light. In this particular scene, I'm going to start by building these one at a time. And we have Andy, who's going to be our subject again. And we've got a Profoto D2 up here with a Magnum reflector. Now, using a Magnum reflector is a little bit bigger than a traditional zoom reflector. This is going to slightly soften the light a little bit, as opposed to a zoom reflector, which is very, very hard. It's not going to soften it in the absolute sense, but it is going to give it a little less harsh of a look, maybe something that feels a little closer to like a classic scoop light, or in some respects a little Fresnel-esque, if you were kind of used to using those older continuous lights back in the day, or you've ever played around with them. And I do love that quality of light, but this is a relatively close approximation to what it's doing. We're going to start with this. I'm going to use my Magnum reflector as my main light to show you what that looks like. Also, I've chosen hard light sources here primarily because they are going to be the easiest for you to see and visualize what I'm doing, because that shadow is going to be the most clearly defined. So let's go ahead and start with this. I'm going to take this light and turn it on. I'm going to use the modeling light. And currently, this light is going everywhere. It's lighting the whole scene. There's no control to it. It's really just blasting him and the background with a ton of light. Just to make my life a little bit easier, I'm going to arbitrarily pick F11. It's not really going to have a huge impact on the scene here, but F11 is a pretty easy f-stop to work with because it lets me kind of work with my numbers, I think, in a pretty straightforward way, and it'll give me a lot of latitude in those shadows to really decide how bright or dark I want them to be. Whereas if I'm starting from, let's say, an F4, I'm going to be more likely to end up bringing in ambient light and other factors, just because that's the nature of shooting with lower apertures. I want to avoid that. I want to be in absolute control. And I also want to make sure that I'm going to have enough of the image in focus. I don't have to worry too much about slightly being off as I might with a lower aperture. I am going to be shooting on the GFX 100S2. I've got a 110mm lens, so it's a little bit of a long portrait lens. Think of a full frame equivalency on this, probably being in the mid 90-ish range. So it's a nice, decent length portrait lens. So I'm going to bring this out, and we're going to do these one at a time, and then I'm going to show you how I control this light, shape it, and make it do what I want a little bit more effectively and easily. All right, so we're going to go ahead and meter this, and we're going to try to get this meter to read F11, which I have arbitrarily decided is where I want to be. I'm going to stick the meter right next to the face. I'm going to point it at the light, and it says 16.8. So I'm going to turn it down 1 full stop and 8/10, and that should read me. All right, so we're reading at 11, okay? What we have is a very straightforward exposure. Now, where you begin when you're photographing people kind of depends a little bit on personal choice. So I find that the tonality of the skin will oftentimes influence how I expose for it. So for example, medium and darker skin tones, I will oftentimes shoot at the exposure reading, whereas sometimes I will be more likely to slightly overexpose a lighter skin tone and wash it out just a little bit. And part of this is because if I'm going to shoot something that feels a little bit more vintage inspired, a slight overexposure with a higher contrast kind of gives me more of that look. The trade-off to it is you're going to get less kind of shape and definition to the bone structure when you do it a lot of times. Whereas with a darker skin tone, you're going to get a greater difference between the two, and you'll get a little bit more glow specularity to it. And so it's a little bit of a difference. And depending upon the person, you want to make sure you expose for what works best for them. With Andy in particular, I think I'm going to slightly overexpose him by about 1/3 of a stop. And there's a couple of ways you can do this. You can either do it in camera by just adding an extra 1/3 to your exposure. So in this particular case, I'm an 11. I would bring it down to a 10. I can also come here to this light, and I can intentionally overexpose it by about 1/3 of a stop, which is what the easiest solution is, what I'm going to do. And so that, I think, works a little bit better in this particular case. Now, there's still a little bit of light on the background. So, if you are looking for a better way to control it, or if you're in a little bit of a smaller space, this becomes a good opportunity to introduce a grid. Grids are available for all different kinds of modifiers, hard modifiers, soft modifiers. We oftentimes will also call these egg crates for certain soft modifiers. This particular grid is made for the Magnum, and you can kind of see this little honeycomb pattern. It is not going to change the quality of light. It's not going to make this hard light a soft light source, but instead what it's going to do is it's going to restrict the spill of light to create a little bit more of a tighter beam, a little bit more of a tunnel of light. And you can potentially lose a teeny bit of light when you do it on your main exposure, but you will see a big difference on the background. It's already a little dark. It is going to go very dark. And again, this is all about control. I'm going to take one more shot here before I add it so you can see the wider scene, and you'll also see how restricted it becomes on his body. So like I said, even though it is dark, you can see that there's a little bit of spill on the back. It actually looks nice. So the thing is it doesn't actually look bad. It actually gives me a nice little bit of separation between him and the background. But today's all about control, so I'm going to show you how to restrict the light a little bit more. Now, I was at 11.3 before, so now, just for point of reference, so it's down to 8.6. So I lost about 2/3 of a stop of light. I'm going to turn it up to compensate. Up close, you'll see that the background goes very dark. And far away, you can see that the background gets even darker. And the fall off on the body goes down quite a bit as well. So again, just about giving me that extra layer of control and shape to the light. And this is still pretty frontward facing. If I were to move it off to the side or bring it in a little bit, it would restrict it even more. But I think this is a really good start. Before and after, you can see there is a slight exposure difference on the face still, but overall the image is substantially darker, and you lose a lot of the body now. It puts all of the light on the face. Again, just helps me out with that control. How we want to change the exposure of the key can drastically change how we feel about it. If I were to take this and make it a stop brighter, if I were to change it and make it a stop darker, or anywhere in between, that's where you're going to start to introduce some of your creative choices to exposure, which can drastically change how this image looks and feels. I'm going to give you two different versions of it. Here it is a stop brighter. And here it is a stop darker from where we were originally, which I think is too dark. But just kind of shows you what kind of changes you can get. I actually think I'm going to go somewhere in between, and I'm going to add maybe an extra half a stop to that original baseline exposure because I want to. I think this looks very good. Okay. So variations on my key here. This lets you decide exactly what you want that image to look and feel like. Next thing we're going to introduce is the fill light. Now the fill light's job is to come in and kind of modify, a lot of times, the look and the feel of the key. So maybe you've got very, very dark shadows. We want to lighten them up. Or maybe you want to add a color to the image. Maybe you want to add some blue or some red to the shadows. This would be the chance to come in and do it. Now you can use many different kinds of modifiers, and you can have many different kinds of positions and powers to the fill, and this is going to change the mood of those shadows. So basically, how bright or dark do I want those shadows to be? That's by and large how I want to think about this. My two main choices here in terms of quality of light really are hard or soft. Do I want that fill light to feel kind of metallic and specular, but it's going to give me some extra shadows? Or do I want to go with a softer, less distracting fill light? Maybe something that smooths out the skin a little bit and makes everything feel a little bit more flattering. These are totally different choices, and they each have their purposes, and it totally depends on you. A lot of times, people find that a softer fill light can be a little easier to work with, and it almost feels like you're using the shadow slider in real life. But if you want it to feel maybe a little bit more vintage, we're going to channel Karsh a little later today, a harder fill might be the better choice. And you shouldn't always feel like a hard fill light is the wrong choice. There's lots of great creative opportunities in a whole range of modifiers and quality of light. So I'm going to show you what each of those look like, and then I'm going to show you how different power can affect the shadows as well. Currently, my second light is just a D2 with a zoom reflector. It is going to be a hard light source. You are going to notice it in the scene. Now, depending upon where you shoot this, the shadow on the background that it creates may be noticeable or it may not. If I were shooting full body, I might not use this. If I'm going to shoot close up, I might be able to shoot around the shadow. It really depends on what you're doing. I like to use the groups on these lights set up in a way that makes the most sense for me. Usually, I set my key light up as A. I set my fill light up as B. I will usually set my rim or rim lights up as C. My background is D. If I'm using other lights, I might have to use more letters, but generally it's how I like to set it up because it makes the most sense for me. A, B, C, D. That's how it goes. I'm going to show you this here really quick. With this light, we can meter it separately. It might be easier in some instances to turn your key off, especially if they are coming from somewhat of the same direction. But I'm going to show you how the retracting bulb works for you here as well as an extra solution to not have to turn them off. So I am currently at f11. There is no rule that says how bright your fill light needs to be, but it's going to be less bright, right? And so you have to kind of think about what you want your starting place to be. Now I showed you what exposure looks like in terms of stops in the other video, but I'm going to show you now how we think about that in combination with the key light. My exposure on my camera is staying the same. I haven't changed it at all. It has been at f11 the entire time. f11, 1/125th, ISO 100. It's been that the whole time. Even when I was changing the power of my key, I'm changing the appearance of that light, not the exposure of the camera, and the same is true here. And so the way that I like to think about using a fill light is stops underneath my key. How do I want it to feel? If it is the same power, they are even, and it's not going to really feel like it's creating too much shape. It's going to be flat light. Think of like a yearbook photo. Not bad, it's just very, very flat light. If I want to introduce a little bit of shadow to it, I might have it a stop below. Stop below is going to have a little bit of shape for my key light, but the shadows are going to be very bright, very filled in. 2 stops below, a little bit more of a drama. 3 stops, very dramatic. 4 stops, so dramatic that you start to lose detail in the shadows. So very, very dark in those shadows, but still offering you some form of control. Personally, my preference is to start from a place where my fill light is usually between 2 to 3 stops below the key. And this is where knowing your f-stops comes in, but fortunately the 2-stop thing is the easiest. It's half. So every 2 stops, remember, roughly halves are doubles, with a couple of the incremental 10th stops being the outliers. But I'm shooting at f11. So 2 stops down from f11 is 5/6. If I wanted my fill light to be 2 stops below, I would meter that 4/5/6. If I wanted it to be 3 stops below, it'd be f4, so forth and so on. And that's kind of how it works. It's also one of the reasons that I typically, personally, like to start from places of full stops. It's just easier for me to do the math, but you don't have to. Now, it starts to get tricky when you get within that 1 stop range. So let's say the exposure is f11, this is reading f11, and I get that to read f8. You will notice right around there, and it's a negligible amount, the exposure over the whole image starts to increase. And it's only within that last, roughly, that last stop. Because as soon as you start to get within that, the overall exposure will change. As long as you're not, it won't, at least not in a way that's that noticeable. But it's kind of like the idea of doubling or halving light, like with an f-stop. if I doubled the amount of light, I'm going to increase the f-stop. So if I meter this at f11, and I also meter that at f11, I have doubled the light. Instead of equaling out the shadow, what I've done is flattened out the image, but I've also made it go to f16 because that's the extra stop up. And as soon as you start getting that close, you will notice that difference. Underneath that, you won't notice it really at all. Let me show you what that looks like in practice. I'm going to start from 4 stops below. I'm going to go 3, 2, 1, and then I'm going to show you what happens when you shoot it at 1:1 and how you have to compensate. So, at 4 stops below, if this is reading f11, I just basically split the number in half. So half of this is 5.6, half of that is 2.8. So I'm going to take this retracted dome, I'm going to angle it away from this light. I want to make sure no light is hitting this, and I want to make sure that light reads 2.8. That's where we're going to start with 4 stops underneath. It's 2.08, and I want it to be 2.8, which is 2 more tenths of a stop. There, 2.8 even. Okay, this is going to be 4 stops between the two. Now the nice thing about this, you can see that the 4 stops is very, very dark, is I can turn this up 1 full stop at a time by remote. And so I'm going to do that right now without metering it. But this is going to be 1 stop up in the shadows. This is, so we're now at 3 stops below. This is basically reading at 4. Another stop. This is going to read 5.6. This is going to read 8. And you can see how under the neck it gets a lot brighter. Then we go up 1 more stop. This is basically both of them at 11. And you can see everything gets a bit brighter. And then if I take the whole exposure down, what you've got is something closer. You can kind of see once we tweak it and we compare it to the other ones, we are looking at about a half a stop difference. And those are just things that we want to double check based on the space, the modifiers we're using, and how it is actually kind of mixing all together to end up with exactly the measurement that you need. So for me personally, I like about a 2 to 3 stop differential between my key and my fill as a starting point. So since I'm at f11, I'm going to go ahead and start from around a 4 or a 5.6 as a base. And just to confirm this, make it easier for myself, I'm going to go ahead and flip the key off and get a meter of my fill light separate of anything else. So let's take a shot just so you can see exactly what the fill light is doing with nothing else. And you can see here it is on the right-hand side, lifting up those shadows a little bit. Remember, I'm still at f11 on my camera, ISO 101/125th. None of this has changed. And there you go. It just kind of lifts up, especially under the neck a little bit. If I flip it off, here it is with no fill under that neck, and you can see how it gets much, much darker. So it just gives that nice silvery kind of tonality to those shadows. If you don't want to create shadows in the scene from a hard light, you can also use a softer light source for your fill. One of my favorite ways to do this is just by bouncing a light off the back of the room, but if the room you're in isn't particularly conducive to that, you can even use something like a big soft white umbrella as a solution. I love big soft umbrellas because they are very easy to put together. And so just to illustrate the difference between the hard fill and the soft fill, we now got a Profoto Umbrella Deep White XL to give a little bit of a smoother, softer fill to the shadows. And I'm going to meter this to be the same thing. So I'm also looking for a 5.6. Again, have flipped my key light off. I'm going to try to meter this separately. And it's 5.6.1, so it's a little off, but turn it down 1/10 just so we're right there on it. And this is going to just throw a ton of light everywhere and fill in all my shadows less noticeably. You can see how the exposure is pretty similar, but you aren't getting that harsh edge shadow over on the left-hand side of the frame that you were kind of in the other image if you shot it far enough away. You'll notice there's a little bit of a different specularity to the skin. Also, the catch light's a little bit bigger, but overall, it's just not quite as noticeable. And regularly, I also like to come in and put this right behind camera so that it creates even less of a shadow. But when you combine this with the main light, what you'll get is something that looks like this. So is it better or worse to use a hard fill or a soft fill? And that really depends. It depends on what you're looking for, depends on what your subject looks like, how you want to kind of affect their skin, or you want a specularity to the skin, you want a glow to it, a silvery effect on the skin, or do you want something that's a little bit smoother, something that takes the edge off using hard light. Either of these options can work for you, and it really depends on what you're going for in the image. Personally, I'm going to lean into my hard light modifiers today, so I am going to go back to the zoom reflector as my fill, but you can still get beautiful results out of this, and this is a pretty common solution. 5-6 on the money. People think you can't use a hard light as fill. That is absolutely not true. You absolutely can. Do whatever you want. There you go. Similar exposure to those shadows as we compare them side by side. They don't actually look that different, but when you look under the neck, you can kind of see that cross section of the shadow, how the hard light is going to make something a little bit more defined, whereas the soft one, nowhere near as much. But what I like about it is just that you get the specularity, kind of the sheen from it that you don't quite get here. That's just getting into the kind of minutia of it, but personal preference. Let's talk about the rim light. Now, the rim light is used to separate your subject from the background. The rim light, like the background light, is doing this, and you can use it. You don't have to. It's a stylistic choice. In this particular case, my rim light is opposite to my key, kind of creating that directionality, giving me a little bit of separation on the back of the head. It can be on both sides. You can have multiple rim lights. It's put colors on these lights. It's absolutely your call. In this particular case, what I have is another magnum reflector back there to give me a little bit more of that characteristic quality of light that I like from my main light. I've also got a grid on it as well to control the spill and maybe minimize the flare of it pointing directly at camera. I'm going to flip off both my key and my fill light so I can better visualize what this light is doing. Again, like I said, I like to put this on C. That's fine. Okay. I'm going to start from this being at exposure, just to, again, give us a frame of reference. So I want to make this read f11 like my key light. I probably wouldn't use it this bright. Karsh would oftentimes, as we're going to show you a little bit later. Totally a matter of what your personal taste is. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to make it read f11. I'm going to put it behind the back of Andy's head, point it at that light, and read it. And it's very, very low. All right, now it is reading f11. Again, see how easy that is. I know exactly what the light is going to read. And this rim light on the back side gives me this. This is at exposure, right? If I can combine it with my other lights, what I'm going to get is something that looks like this. So let's say you're looking at this light and you decide that that rim light is a little too powerful for you. So let's turn it down a stop. You get something that looks like this. You can also turn it down a little bit more. I'm going to turn it down another stop. And you can get something very incredibly subtle compared to your main light. It all depends on what you're after. Again, no right or wrong here. Can exist anywhere on the spectrum of that. You don't even have to make these changes in full stops. It can be as 10-stop increments if you want. But this is how I'm thinking about light. And this is also a way that gives me that extra layer of control and separation, separating my subject from the background. I'm going to bring this back up one stop, and I'm going to leave it there. If I wanted this rim light to act more as a total wraparound around the back of the head, I might add one above. I might add another one above. I might just raise it up a little bit. I might add one to the other side. There's a great variety of combinations you can use with this to decide how you want that separation to happen. All right. Lastly, what we are going to do is flip on the background light. Again, I have a zoom reflector here to help me control the light. And currently, it is all over that background. When it comes to metering the light on the background, there's a couple of different ways you can do it. You can, if you have a reflected meter, meter the light that bounces off the background, if you go that route. But I know it's a little specialty, and not everybody has one of those. So you can also meter the light directly at the source. But it's not really an exact science, because light reflects off different surfaces differently. A canvas backdrop versus a white backdrop versus a gray backdrop. It's all going to look different, and it all depends on what you're after. So you might find that in this particular case, it's going to be helpful for you to play it a little bit by eye. It really depends on how you prefer to work. I'm going to take one quick shot here just to see where we're at before I do anything to it. And what you'll see is probably a lot of light across that background. There is a lot of light across that background. So I've got a background light I'm going to throw on this grid. And this is a 10-degree grid, which is going to give me a little bit of a pretty tight beam of light. So as you can see, there's a big gradient of light on the background currently, but when I throw this on, it becomes a much smaller beam. And the grid that you pick gets to decide what that beam is going to look like. Now for me, I'm looking for just a little kiss of light kind of above the shoulders, and it's why having these modeling lights on can be very, very helpful, because it lets me know exactly where that light needs to be pointed. So there's my background light, and if you want it to be more powerful, you can simply turn it up. I'm going to turn it up a stop. I can turn it up another stop. Or I can turn it way down. Now, you might ask yourself, this doesn't necessarily feel very creative. This feels like a yearbook photo. Yeah, I mean, this is very much a formal structure. It's the combination of these that you use that's going to yield your creative results. It also depends on what you're trying to achieve. In this particular case, yeah, I mean, it's a key fill rim background. It is very formulaic with lots of light in the shadows, but this can work. Let me show you how we can take this formula, take this understanding of how we're setting things up, add some variety into it, and do something very, very different. We are going to start by doing a little bit of an homage to a classic Karsh photograph of John F. Kennedy, where he's kind of turned to the side a little bit. It will create, it's this beautiful silvery shot. It's very kind of introspective as he has hands folded. He's actually sitting on a chair. So one of the first things we're going to do is put him in a chair that gives him a little bit of a better body posturing. And then I'm going to build the light around him. In this shot, what you've got is a Rembrandt light on the face. He's in profile, and there is a triangle of light on the unlit side of the face, which is closest to camera. The light coming in from the fill is about a 2-stop differential from my key to my fill. There's a little bit of a rim light from behind, and there's a little bit of a background light because of the environment. I'm actually going to apply this with a slight twist and get something very, very creative to show you how this yearbook photo setup, we're going to call it, can transform into something much more interesting. Okay. Oops. I'm going to start by swapping out the chair. In this shot, Kennedy was in an armchair, like a leather armchair. We don't quite have that on hand, but I'm not really going to shoot the chair. It's more of just kind of general body position and feel. Maybe lean forward a little bit. You kind of put your hands up this way. You have to lean down a little bit, I think. I know the arms don't quite go as high as we would hope. Then head up a little, and then kind of cross this. There you go. Let me see. And then head up a little bit for me. That's going to be great. That's going to look great. Okay. So, because he's facing camera left, I'm going to take my key light and I'm going to swing it around. But instead of using this, I'm going to do something different, and I'm going to use a modifier that I really like, which is called a Fresnel. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to swap it out, and I'm going to make this a Fresnel. The reason I like a Fresnel is because it has a slightly different quality of light. It feels much more like the lights that Karsh would use. It has a lens on the front of it that has these ripples. It's basically similar to the lenses they use in lighthouses, so it changes kind of the projection of light. It's also a little bit softer, so when the hard light goes through this glass element, it's still hard, but just not quite as harsh, if that makes sense. Okay. I'm going to end up using this as a fill, so we're going to bring this back over here for just a second. And I'm going to take this Fresnel. You do not have to use a Fresnel on this. You can use a zoom reflector as a hard light source. One of the things that I will also like to do is take a zoom reflector and throw a diffusion over the end of it just to soften it up a hair. But since we have this, why not go full authentic or most of the way there to the quality of light that would have been used. Great. And so what I'm trying to create is that Rembrandt light on the front of the face, and I want to make this read 11. Let's just keep it consistent. I'm going to turn off my other lights just because I find this helpful. It also lets me see exactly what I'm doing. And so you can kind of see this triangle right here from the nose. You lift your head up just a little bit when you lean forward, and head up a little. I just want to see where that light is. I think I have to lower this light a little bit. I think one of the challenges of this particular chair is just the arms are a little lower than I'd like for them to be. And so him having to lean forward, I don't want to lose kind of his eyes underneath his brow. Okay, one more time for me. And then turn your face back to me a little. That's going to be right, where you are right there. Ooh, very bright. All right, so I'm at 11 right now. I'm not going to take a photo yet because this is why I want to show you how effective a meter can be before you even push the button. I'm going to take A and I'm going to turn it off. And I'm going to flip B on. And I mentioned that I was going to use the zoom reflector, or sorry, I mentioned that I was going to use the Magnum reflector with the grid. So I'm going to go ahead and put that on. And in this particular shot, if you look really closely at it, it is a hard light source, and it is slightly from camera right and a little bit above. And it's got about a 2-stop difference between the key and the fill. So about 2 stops, 2.5 stops. I'm at 5.6, so I'm really going to be okay at about 5.6 or just below. It's 5.67. This is 4.08. It's about 4.5. So this, I think, is a really good starting point. This light over here is going to be my rim light. And I'm going to move it a little bit more in. He also had a little bit of a hair light on it as well. And so that's having it above is going to be helpful for that. I did move it in a little closer, so I'm going to pull power down. I was a stop below before. I think that looked good. So I probably want it to be at about f8. Yep, there. Move it up a little bit. There we go. Cool. And the background light, I actually liked where it was before, but because Andy's sitting a little bit lower, I'm just going to angle this light down a little bit. And this is where it gets a little bit different from the Kennedy shot, but there was a bit of background detail, and I'm just going to add a little bit. So I'm at f11, 1/125th, ISO 100. I'm going to go a little bit more freewheeling on this. Thank you. And can I have you do the position again for me, please? Lean forward, where you were before. That's great. On. They're all on. They're looking good. And then lift your head up just a little bit. There you go, good. And then just your eyes down for me. Look down, look lower. Beautiful. Very, very Karsh-esque. We're going to throw in one other little variable here. You know, using older lenses and older cameras, there were certain characteristics that they had that modern lenses don't. They're very, very clean, very precise. And sometimes I like to muddy these images up just a little bit. So what I'm going to do is introduce some filters. And I use these quite a bit. They all more or less, the ones that I use, do similar things. Hollywood Black Magics, Black Pro Mists, Glimmer Glass, Black Satins. And depending upon my mood, I will change different ones. But they introduce certain soft characteristics sometimes to these images, which take the hardness, the really extra sharpness that these lenses do a great job with, makes them feel a little bit more organic, a little bit more character. And that's usually my personal preference. So watch this. Beautiful. That looks awesome. Bring the hands a little bit more together. Really great. That looks nice. Lift the head up just a little bit for me. Excellent. That looks so good. So good. And so if you were to compare these side by side, you'd see that some of that really strong contrast of the original image is taken away, and it has a little bit more of that kind of organic look to the light. Now in these, I do think the light is a little bit high on the eyeball. I'm going to drop it down a hair so I don't lose him totally under the brow, and I think we'll be very, very close. Give me a little bit of a furrowed brow. Excellent. Love it. Beautiful. Looks great. Very Karsh-esque. So this just shows you how you can take that relatively fundamental formula of key, fill, rim, background, put your own little twist and spin on it, change it to be exactly what you want. And even if the meter doesn't get you exactly where you want it to be without pushing the button, it is getting you very, very close. So the changes you make are very, very minor based on your subject matter. And so we just had to make a couple of tweaks once we got it in place, and then I could get the shot that I needed, and it lended to some really fun, creative results. Now I'm going to take this idea one more time. We're going to change it up just a little bit and show you how you can do another version of this with a different configuration of lights. To stay on theme with Karsh, we're going to do a recreation of Karsh's shot of Hemingway, one of my favorite portraits kind of ever created. We're going to switch up the formula just a little bit, in so much as we're not going to use a background light, and we are going to use 2 rim lights, but we're going to move some things around a little bit, keep the rough idea, and get a different shot. Now instead this time of starting from the front with the key light, we're actually going to start with the rims. And the reason for that is because both of my rim lights are going to act as two equally weighted lights. So I want to go ahead and dial that in first. Both of those are going to live on my group C. I'm going to go back there and I'm going to meter what that light is at the back of his head. I am at ISO 100, 1/125th, and just for consistency's sake, let's keep it around f11 here as well. So I'm reading both of these at about f16. So I'm going to go ahead and take my rim lights down about a stop. So they're reading just over f11 now, which means, like the original Hemingway shot, they're going to be a skosh bright. I'm going to go ahead and take a picture of this to show you what the rim lights look before we add in any of the other lights. Now, in this particular case, I think maybe the rim lights are looking a little bit dark. I think just to pop it out a little bit, I'm going to increase them by about a half a stop. And I think that looks pretty good. I have to keep in mind the dark sweater, color of his hair. You can definitely see that one side is catching it just a little bit more. Just going to happen sometimes with different people's hair color. Lighter color is going to light up a little bit more. Darker hair is not going to light as much. The amount of hair changes things. And you can see how much light is hitting the back of his shoulders as opposed to the head as well. So those things are all going to kind of weigh into the equation a little bit. But I think this is a really good place to start. And if I decide, when I put everything together, that I want to make those rim lights a little bit brighter, because they are both together on my group C, I can grab them and turn them up on command. For my main light, I'm again going to use the Fresnel. I'm going to go ahead and flip this on. And in the original image, it's a little bit of a downward light. It is creating a lot of dimensionality on the face. And you actually, because of Hemingway's pretty heavy brow, aren't able to see it in the image. The catch light that you're actually seeing in the original image is the fill. So it is pretty high up, and you can also tell by the shape of the shadow under the nose. It's a pretty hard shadow, and it's a little bit off to the left, something kind of like this. Beautiful. And I'm going to meter this again, looking for f11. It was very, very close. Now, I'm going to have you bring your head down just a little bit. And this is going to actually hide the catch light in the eye from the Fresnel, just so that you can kind of see what's happening here. I'm going to bring the light a little bit more to the front of the face. Just losing you a little bit. Get your face just a little bit to me. Perfect. That's great. That's great. Okay. These shadows, though, are pretty dark, but it's honestly, it's very, very close. I'm going to add, this is where the silvery nature of it comes in. Again, aiming for about a 2.5 stop difference, 2.5 stop difference from my fill light. Now, in this particular case, I'm going to try to position it relatively close to my frame, but just high enough that it's able to hide the shadow behind my main light. Now, currently, it's a hard light. I'm going to soften it a little bit, and this is one of my little tricks when I'm dealing with hard light, where I want to soften it just a skosh. I'm going to start with my zoom reflector, and I'm going to add beauty dish diffusion, called this a sock. Right? Now, obviously, it doesn't fit, so I'm going to clip it. Clip it. And it's not going to make it a soft light source, but it's going to make it a little bit softer. And it's just a nice little lightening up of that light source. Again, I'm at 11 here. I'm going to aim for around 4 or 5 with the meter. Without the main light, this is what this is doing. Very little bit, right? But when I add the main light, you'll also get a nice catch light to the eyes as well. Beautiful. And that's where you're going to get kind of that silvery tonality to the image by lifting up those shadows kind of right there, which looks really, really nice. Again, you can make this be whatever you want it to be. So if you are looking at it and you're like, well, I kind of wish my fill light were a little bit brighter, you can absolutely turn it up. Or maybe I want my key light a little bit darker, or I want my rim lights a little bit brighter. They can all be dialed in based on whatever it is you want. Throw that brow a little bit. And that is how we do Karsh. Now, obviously, he does not have the old weathered look that Karsh does, but you can definitely see how we've come in and we have channeled that look with this sort of an image. Now we can get a little bit more creative if you want, depending upon your preference. I think I'm going to do one more thing just to make something I like a little bit better. I'm going to introduce a flag to control the light just a little bit on the face. For me, I think a little bit too much attention is going to the forehead, and so I'm going to feather that off a little bit. Another thing that you can do here is if you have a modifier with barn doors, you can bring that down. But what I'm going to do instead is we're just going to grab a flag and hold it over top. Go right there. I think that looks great. Turn my key light just a little. That looks great right there. Punch that jaw for me. Open the eyes just a little bit. Great. And what that's going to do is it's just going to cut a little bit more attention at the face. It kind of just brings a little bit off that. Just makes it feel a little bit more silvery. And I think overall this looks pretty awesome. Two different iterations of Karsh using a somewhat similar set of tools. As you start to play around with this and you start to utilize it in your own way, the different combinations will yield different results. So I encourage you to get out there, kind of start from a place of measurability and really look at these images that you love and try to figure out how they're done. It's kind of how I learned how to do this, and you will eventually along the way find your preferred way to work and your style and your way to create the images that you love.